Okay, this is the first set of notes on plant life cycles. We're going to do a little bit of a recap on some stuff that you went over on your own last week and a bit the week before. Things like going over alternation of generations and a little bit of plant evolution. But we're also going to look at the at the life cycle of bryophytes. So that's towards the end of this set of notes. A couple of reminders: make sure that you've grabbed the handout when you came in. Feel free to add to it, write down everything instead of freehand writing these notes in your notebook directly. You can just fill out the handout. However, I do want to also emphasize it's important to make sure you have audio on. There are going to be some parts that are not necessarily written on the slide, but I'm going to talk about. It's your job to make sure that you record those things as well. You're just as responsible for audio components. So I tried to leave spaces where I could, especially when it came to slides that just have a diagram on them. I tried to leave space there for you so you can add more to them, so when you go back to those slides, you know what's going on the slide. So make sure you jot those things down too. Okay, so let's get started. Just a bit of so last week, one of the things that we went over were the characteristics that all plants have. And I'm not going to list them all out. There are about 6 of these things, these characteristics. They were in the Bozeman video that you guys watched and answered questions to. But some of these traits were things like all plants have eukaryotic cells, or all plants have cells that have cell walls made of this substance called cellulose. Most plants participate in photosynthesis to take sunlight energy and convert it into food, things like that. But one of the characteristics that was mentioned is an alternation of generations. And this is a unique life cycle that plants participate in. And it's unique because it has 2 phases that it flip-flops between. And these 2 phases are, there's a diploid phase, and diploid just means that the cells involved have 2 sets of genetic material, 2 sets of DNA. And actually the symbol 2N is used. N means a set of DNA or genetic material. So 2N means diploid, 2 sets. There's also a haploid phase, and we use the symbol N because the cells involved only have 1 set of DNA or genetic material. And it's so this flip-flopping back and forth between these 2 alternating phases that we call the alternation of generations. Okay. Now in your textbook on page 552, you'll see this diagram, and it's a very simplified version of what alternation of generations looks like, but we'll apply this when we look at more specific life cycles like the bryophyte life cycle today and the fern life cycle tomorrow. Okay, but you can see how it's divided up into the phases. So in orange, that's the haploid component, and everything that you see there has an N beside it because it's the cells involved in this part are only have half the normal amount of DNA, right? Only 1 set. And then in the diploid phase, which is in blue, you can see that 2N is used because the cells involved in this phase have 2 sets of DNA. Okay, so during these 2 phases, or throughout these 2 phases and this alternating of generations, there are 2 types of cell division that are happening, and you went through a process of reviewing what those 2 types are, mitosis and meiosis. So I'll just give you a quick recap. Mitosis is a type of cell division that the final result, the daughter cells that result, have the same amount of DNA as the original parent cell that they came from. So mitosis is all about making the same type of cells as the parent cell that they came from. Meiosis, however, is a type of cell division where the final result should be daughter cells that have half the normal amount of DNA. So these are what we refer to as gametes in most cases, sperm cells, egg cells. Spores, in the case of the life cycle of a plant, also are haploid, incidentally. But meiosis is the process of you starting out with a diploid cell and eventually making haploid cells from it. Okay, so now in each of these 2 phases of the life cycle of a plant, the plant takes on different forms. So during the diploid phase, the plant is in the form of something called a sporophyte. And sporophyte just means that it's a plant that is producing spores, or giving rise to spores. And then the haploid phase, the plant takes on the form of something called a gametophyte or gamete producing plant. Okay, so what is a sporophyte? Okay, so I mentioned that plant spores are haploid, so they only have these they only have half the amount of DNA in them. But these are little reproductive cells that are made inside of a sporophyte, and the way that they're produced is meiosis. A diploid cell goes through the process of dividing twice, and you end up with these little spores. And they're not exactly seeds, but they're very similar in terms of, like, if you consider when you take a seed and you plant it and it'll sprout and turn into a plant, that's kind of what spores do. They do sprout and grow into a structure. And in fact, when a spore sprouts and grows up, it turns into something called a gametophyte. Okay, so then what's a gametophyte? So a gametophyte is a form of the plant that produces gametes, and gametes, like sperm cells and egg cells, are reproductive cells that are many copies are made by a gametophyte. So these sperm cells and egg cells, it's not just one or two that are made. Millions of them are made through the process of mitosis, just making copy after copy. And then these sperm and egg cells will eventually get released, and hopefully a sperm cell and an egg cell come together. And when they do, we call that fertilization. And that fertilized egg eventually turns into should develop and turn into a sporophyte, and that kind of completes the process again. So it might seem a little bit confusing, but when we look at the life cycle of a bryophyte, for example, today, it'll kind of clear things up a little bit more. But of course, if you have questions, feel free to pause this video and then ask me. I'm walking around, so feel free to ask me, and I can clarify for you if you need it. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a recap on the evolutionary history of plants, just touching on some important things that you should have gotten from the independent work that you guys did last week. So most of the Earth's history, plants actually didn't exist. So life was mostly focused on aquatic environments like oceans and lakes and streams. But eventually plants started to appear on land. Okay, there we go. So for most of history, plants didn't exist. But eventually plants started to colonize on land. They started to show up on land. And that set a ball in motion, an evolutionary ball in motion, if you will, of the environment on land transforming so that other organisms, including more complex plants, could develop. Okay, and so if you think about it, plants, before plants would colonize on the ground, on land, on dry land, the dry land would probably be very rocky, not very much, no vegetation. But little by little, as the very smallest plants could establish themselves, those plants, if you consider, when they die, they decompose and they'll create something similar to soil, and over time you end up with more and more soil. That accumulation of organic material helps to provide a foundation for other plants to grow. And when those plants die and decompose, you end up with more soil. And more of that happens, you end up with more foundation for better, bigger plants to be able to set root and develop. And so as a result of these few plants, these earliest plants kind of showing up, eventually ecosystems started to transform and arise on land. And then that gave rise to an environment that could have more and more complex plants, organisms show up. Okay, so what we do know is that there's DNA evidence that confirms that the very first plants evolved from organisms that are very similar to what our modern day green algae looks like. So algae actually isn't a plant; it's more like a protist. Um, but there are some similarities. Green algae does participate in photosynthesis. There are some similarities to plants, and so there is evidence that something similar must have been a common ancestor, and then eventually you have the earliest plants, the first plants, um, actually started to what we have fossil evidence that shows earliest plants actually looked very similar to what our modern day mosses and other bryophytes kind of look like. They, for example, they were very small. They didn't really have any vascular system. They needed water in order to complete their life cycles, just like modern day mosses and so on. But over time, as these plants, establish themselves on dry land, the demands of life on land started to favor the evolution of plants that could cope with the environment, the harsher environment on dry land versus in the water. So some of these evolutionary changes that we see are things like being able to be more resistant to the drying effects of the sun, being able to conserve water, and not dry out so quickly. And then not only that, but unlike the earliest plants that needed water to complete their life cycles, there became a need for, or there was evolutionary change in favor of plants that didn't really need water as much to be able to reproduce. Okay, so over the course of looking at different fossil evidence and genetic evidence and so on, the we know that the evolutionary tree looks very similar for modern day plants, looks very similar to this. There's actually, we can reduce it down to 4 very broad features that kind of create the foundation for this evolutionary tree. So here, down at the bottom, this is a cladogram. So down at the bottom is a common ancestor for everything. So that would have been that green algae-like ancestor. And then it's not on here. You might want to add it in, but this would have been where the first trait, which is being able to establish on land, or land plant trait, would have been here. And then eventually you have the next trait, which is development of vascular tissue. But before that trait developed, it was a branch off to modern day mosses and their relatives. Okay, then the next trait was the development of seeds, and ferns and their relatives branched off just before that. Then you have, and then lastly, you have flowers. Seeds enclosed with fruit kind of ties in with that too, but flowers is the main trait that we talked about last week. And so cone-bearing plants branched off before that, conifers, gymnosperms. And then finally, the last branch is flowering plants, angiosperms. Now, we're not going to look at all of these today. That would be kind of nuts to do as a single set of notes. You would be here forever. But we're going to focus just for today to finish up these notes. We're going to look at the life cycle of mosses and their relatives. So this is, of the 4 that you see here, this is the most similar to what like the first plants were, the fossil evidence, the first types of plants were on Earth. Okay, so these are called bryophytes. So bryophytes are basically just non-vascular plants, and so vascular tissue is specialized tissue that is used to transport substances like water and nutrients through a plant. So kind of like an internal plumbing system. And bryophytes don't have this internal plumbing system. As you can see on the evolutionary tree, they branched off before vascular tissue showed up. So because they don't have these specialized tissues, bryophytes need to be in environments that allow water to come in contact with most of the plant. And in fact, the way that they do get water to all of the cells in the plant is by absorbing water from their environments directly through the tissues, and that's through osmosis. So a lot of times, these plants have to be very small, very low to the ground, so that any moisture on the ground gets in contact with the majority of the plant. So they stay pretty low. So some examples are mosses, like you can see on this tree here, this damp tree. Mosses are an example of a bryophyte. Liverworts, like you can see here, which it's a little hard to see, but they are also very, very flat, kind of low plants. And then here you have hornworts, and the plant itself is actually right here, and these are sporophytes and gametophytes, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, but the plant itself is very low to the ground. It's just this patch right here. Okay, so we're going to finish this off by looking at the life cycle of a bryophyte. There are a couple of key characteristics I should mention. So whenever you see a bryophyte, whether it's you come across a patch of moss or something, or looking at these examples here, right, with the liverworts and the hornworts, the most dominant and recognizable stage of the life cycle of a bryophyte is its gametophyte phase. When you see those plants, you're more than likely you're looking at a gametophyte phase. And then another key characteristic that I mentioned already is that because they're non-vascular, bryophytes rely heavily on water for their life cycle, specifically their fertilization, the fertilization part. Sperm cells actually have to swim through water to get to an egg to fertilize it, so water needs to be present. And so bryophytes, you tend to find them in areas that are damp most of the year, rainforests and so on, things like that. Okay. So here is the life cycle of a bryophyte. This is on page 558 of your textbook if you want to refer back to it. But this looks like a lot all at once, so we're going to actually zoom in and look at each of the phases. So we're going to start with this orange right here. This is the haploid phase. Okay, so here, and then feel free, like I said, to fill in, add extra stuff to this to explain. Okay, so you can see, actually it's cut off a little bit, but right here, let's start up here. You can see that there are these spores. So remember, those are reproductive cells that are made by sporophytes. But these little spores, they are released by the sporophyte. They're released and they get in contact with water. And when they get in contact with water, they actually germinate or sprout and produce these little filaments, these little fibers. These are called protonema. And they're basically like baby gametophytes. Okay, the starting of gametophytes. So these eventually will develop. And so they grow and develop. They form rhizoids, which are not like true roots, but they do something very similar to roots. They're just like specialized cells that are really good at sucking up moisture and passing it on to the rest of the plant, passing it on to the other cells in the plant. Okay, so these protonema get bigger, they develop rhizoids, the little root-like structures you see there, and then here you can see fully developed gametophytes. Now they look, if ever what we're looking at is specifically the life cycle of moss. So if ever you've seen like the fuzzy appearance of moss, that fuzziness that you see are these gametophytes, and they look like little tiny hairs, but they're each individual gametophytes. So gametophytes for moss look like this, but at the very top is the actual reproductive part. Okay, reproductive structures, and there are two types. So when the gametophytes produce sperm cells, we call this gametophyte an antheridia, and here it is up close. So inside is where sperm cells are made, and then eventually they get released. If, however, egg cells are produced, inside a gametophyte. It's called an archegonia, and here's one zoomed in. Looks like a little pod, and there's the egg cell inside at the bottom. Okay, so when these are fully developed, if it's, by the way, I should mention, some species of moss produce both male and female, like they have some male gametophytes and some female ones, and they produce both. And then you have some that only produce sperm or only produce egg cells. Okay, it depends on the species. But in any case, when these are fully developed, the Antheridia release sperm cells, and then these travel through water, through moisture, and hopefully make them to an archegonia, like you can see right here. So they swim and then make it to a archegonia and actually go in, and hopefully they come in contact with the egg and fertilize it. And so you can see a sperm cell here, which is N haploid, egg cell, which is haploid, and they come together. And when they come together, we call that fertilization, and that marks the end of the haploid phase. And so we'll switch here to the diploid phase. And when sperm and egg cell come together, they produce a fertilized egg, which we call a zygote. And so here is that zygote right at the base of an archegonia. Like if I zoomed in right here, whoops, that's what I'm seeing right here. Okay, so this zygote is now fertilized, and now it has 2N, it's diploid. And so eventually that's going to grow and develop, and this is the same archegonia right here, but that gets bigger, it develops and grows into this and actually starts to sprout, and now this is what we call a sporophyte. Okay, so here's the gametophyte, and then you can see the sporophyte actually coming out of the top. Okay, and so the sporophyte develops, and that sporophyte eventually will have inside, it has like a capsule. Inside of it is where spores are made. So this capsule is called a sporangium, and inside of this sporangium is where meiosis is happening. So cells are being divided to make these haploid spores again that you see here. Okay, so spores are being made inside. When this is fully mature, it's going to rupture, like you can see here, and release spore cells again, and that starts a cycle all over again, and they get, they'll hopefully sprout and turn into protonema, and that's the end of the cycle. Okay, so that's kind of the whole process in terms of alternation of generations. And so I would make a point to highlight a couple things. I'm just going to point them out. Protonema, you should know. Gametophyte, obviously you should know. Antheridia, archegonia, I would highlight them. You do need to know what they are. Zygote, sporophyte, yeah, and then sporangium. Those are terms that I would highlight and make sure that you have the definitions for. Okay, and I believe that's it. Let me double check. Yep, that's it. So tomorrow we'll look at another life cycle. It's going to be life cycle of ferns, but for now, that's the end of the notes. All right, thanks.